Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It is always wonderful to be with you, especially when I get to join you for a second interview in a given week. Hope that you've had a good week and that your weekend is looking good as well. It continues to be busy, as I mentioned in the last episode, with visits and work and all that good stuff. Today, though, it is raining. Right now it is raining, and it sounds wonderful. We get rain in the winter, and then it tends to be pretty dry for months at a time, so it hasn't rained in a while, and I am loving the rain, the sound. I just love to listen to the rain, especially when I'm not in it. When I'm inside and enjoying it from a distance, I very much like that. Although, unfortunately, my best friend in Montana sent me a text today and said it's snowing again, and that her parents got 8 inches, I think, yesterday. Maybe it was a couple days ago. Maybe I mentioned it in the last episode. I don't know. It's just crazy, and I feel guilty living here where it's so nice. But let's talk about books. As I mentioned, we are switching our attention today to suspense crime fiction. I am speaking with author Carla Damron about her newest novel. It is called The Orchid Tattoo. Let me give you a description of the book. It is as follows. Social worker Georgia Thayer can balance her own mental illness with the demands of an impossible job. Mostly. But when her sister vanishes in the dead of night, her desperate quest to find Peyton takes her into the tentacles of a human trafficking network, where she encounters a young victim called Kitten. Kitten is determined to escape. She won't be trapped like the others. She won't sell her soul like Lillian, victim turned madam, feeding the dark appetites of international business moguls and government leaders. But the estate won't let her out of its lethal grip, and her attempts at freedom threaten her very life. Aided by Kitten and at times by the voices in her head, Georgia maneuvers to bring down the kingpin of a state and expose its dark secrets, but her efforts place her, and the few people she allows to get close, in grave danger. And there you have it, the description of The Orchid Tattoo. Again, the author is Carla Damron. This is suspense, it's thriller, it is intense, it's not graphic. I mean, you get a very good sense of what is going on in the story and with the victims of some of these heinous crimes that are being committed. But you know me, I'm not good with super intense, super graphic, super gory, and this is just fast-paced, very intense, very I was just trying to say it will suck you in, but I said very, and then I was like, it's very suck you in, but it will suck you in. The story does suck you in right away. You are rooting for the characters. You are hoping for positive outcomes in the story, and Carla does a really good job of crafting that tale and getting you to invest in those characters. Now, before we turn to the interview, I had an email from Carla after we spoke, and she said, oh shoot, I should have mentioned, and I wanted to make sure I included in what she said. So she said, I should have mentioned that The Orchid Tattoo has won 2 literary awards. The Pencraft Award for Literary Excellence and the Literary Titan Gold Award. So I just wanted to make sure that I said that because that is so exciting. Congratulations to Carla on those 2 awards. Definitely very well deserved. Now I'm going to go ahead and go to the interview so that you can hear Carla talk about the writing and crafting of The Orchid Tattoo. Let's turn now to that interview. Hi, Carla. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'm happy to have you here. Excited to talk about your book, The Orchid Tattoo. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Well, I am a social worker and novelist. I've been a practicing social worker for 4,000 years, it feels like, probably a little more like 35 years. Um, this is my fifth novel, The Orchid Tattoo. I have a mystery series, the Caleb Knowles mystery series. I have three books out in that so far. And then my book prior to The Orchid Tattoo was The Stone Necklace, which is women's fiction. And it won the Women's Fiction Writers Association Star Award for Best Novel.
Oh,
And the
wonderful.
Orchid, yeah, I was excited. And the Orchid Tattoo just came out in September. And I live in South Carolina. I'm married, and we have five fur kids that pretty much rule the house. They're rescues and high management animals, but we love them.
Yes, absolutely. I have a friend who is also a social worker, and I think it's kind of like dog years, right? 1 year is equivalent to numerous years in social work. Just it's such a high stress job.
It can be, and it really requires good self-care. And writing is a part of my self-care, I'd say.
That's good. So in terms of writing, the book again is called The Orchid Tattoo. Can you give an overview of the story?
So yeah, The Orchid Tattoo is a book about it's crime fiction or suspense, and it's about human trafficking. It is from the perspective of three different characters. We have Kitten, who is a 15-year-old girl who has been ensnared by traffickers. We have Lillian, who is an older woman she's in her 20s, but in the trafficking life, that's older. She is ensnared in this world and has actually become part of it and is kind of functions as a madam. And then the main protagonist is Georgia Thayer. And Georgia is a social worker, a troubled woman, complicated woman, whose sister is missing. Her sister Peyton is missing. And her quest to find her sister leads her to this nefarious world of human trafficking. And she's determined to find out what happened to Peyton. So that's sort of the thrust of the novel. Those is from those three perspectives. And it deals with the very troubling issue of human trafficking. My goal was to entertain my readers with great suspense. I wanted this to be a really good take to the beach read. And you have to wear extra sunscreen because you don't want to stop reading. That was one goal. But the more important goal was to educate people about how human trafficking happens and how prevalent it is in our world. And so that's been my mission with this book.
So that was really your jumping off point then, was wanting people to have a story that really sucked them in, but then also gave them important information.
Exactly. I find myself being a social worker all the time. That's what it's like. Social work isn't what you do, it's who you are. Mm-hmm. And all of my books deal with social issues, this one especially.
So what was what prompted you to then decide to write about the issue of human trafficking specifically?
I worked for a while as the executive director of the state chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. And in that work, I did advocacy related to getting more progressive anti-human trafficking legislation passed. I met the most amazing people. I met survivors. I met law enforcement officers. I met prosecutors and advocates, and learned just more and more and more about how this crime happens. I was amazed and stunned and horrified at the breadth of it, how much of it goes on, how it affects people. How horrible the life is if you get pulled into this world. And so it haunted me. And the more I learned about it, the more haunted I was. I served for a while on the County Human Trafficking Task Force, which exposed me to more and more stories about it. I talked to survivors, talked to people who worked with survivors. And I just felt compelled to do my part to educate people about it. So And I love mysteries. I love that genre. And I thought, well, that's a good way to approach it, because if I wrote a nonfiction essay about human trafficking, my market's going to be really tiny. But if I wrote something that people wanted to read anyway, then I've got a bigger audience, and I could let people know how this world operates more. And so that became my point.
Mm-hmm. And also then you have characters that people are rooting for and wanting to, the characters are compelling.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I really wanted that. That was important. In earlier drafts of this novel, it was grittier and darker, and it was difficult to read, because this is a difficult subject to read about, to be honest. It's just painful. And so in rewrites, I decided it didn't need to be gritty. It certainly didn't need to be graphic. What I needed to do was to show these women and how this crime has affected them, but also show their strong survival instincts and their drive to move forward. Kitten is determined to escape these traffickers. That fills her soul from the beginning of the novel. Georgia is determined, desperate to find her sister, and she'll do whatever it takes. And so that drives her. And for Lillian is trying to survive. And that character has the biggest evolution of all as the novel progresses. So all three of them are really have agency, they're motivated, they're pushing forward, and they're trying to do the best with what they have.
It is time for our first break of this episode, but see, I told you that it's not as graphic as it could be, considering the subject matter, and we're going to pick that conversation up once we come back from the break. But in the meantime, you are listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Carla Damron. We are discussing The Orchid Tattoo, her suspense crime fiction novel. Let's return to that interview. And as a reader, I, for one, will say that I appreciated that the subsequent drafts were less graphic. Obviously, I don't know what the original ones were, but as a reader, you still get the picture and the understanding of the situation. But for me personally, it would be a much harder read if it was more graphic. I know some people prefer a little grittier novels, but how do you, as a writer, really decide where that line is?
It's a tricky line, and it moves for different people. But probably the most salient thing that happened to me regarding it was an early draft. I had a friend read it who's a mother, and she said, I just can't. And I realized that's my market. I really want mothers to read this. So I started envisioning what could a mother tolerate, when reading a book like this, as I started writing again. And I said, I don't need to show what happens when the door closes. I just need to show the door closing, and I need to show what the next morning, how the character is experiencing life. If I can show you through her eyes what life is like, I don't need to show you what happened. And so that was sort of became, and the trick for me too was I didn't want to soft sell it. I didn't want to make it look rosy in any way, because this is a horrible thing. So it was a bit of a balancing act, and it took a lot of rewrites to get it to where I think it accomplished what I needed it to accomplish.
Well, and you said earlier that you wanted it to feel a bit like a beach read, and if you're reading something on the beach, you don't want to be sitting on the beach in that sort of environment and just be immersed in this just traumatizing world to a certain extent.
Although it has affected readers powerfully. And some readers say, I had to put it down, but then I had to go back. I'm like, that's okay. Take a break, take a breather. And, I care enough about my readers to not leave them in a dark place. I don't want to say what happens at the end, but right. I think that's important. You have a relationship with the readers, and you hope that they trust you, that they're in good hands when they read your book, and that it's not going to leave you bleak.
And I think the key phrase there is, I had to pick it back up again. They had to put it back down, but it was compelling enough that they needed to pick it back up.
Right. Yeah. One reader said, I put it down. I walked around the house for 15 minutes and then I came back and picked it up. I was like, that's okay. You got some exercise too.
Yeah, absolutely. You've talked a little bit about Georgia and Kitten and Lillian, some of their strengths. You wrote Georgia from the first person perspective and the other two from third person perspective. Can you talk a little bit about writing from different points of view?
Yeah. So I started writing Georgia in third person, and then she wanted me to write in first person. It sounds crazy because we are crazy. Writers are a little crazy. But I also, because I have a pretty immersive writing style. And so I feel like I kind of live in these characters' heads. Georgia's mind is a very complicated place. And I wanted the readers to have a very close firsthand experience of what her life is like. And the reason I say that is Georgia has mental illness. She is a functional woman. She's a social worker. She works in a hospital, which is a very stressful job. But she also hears voices. And I wanted the voices. The reader gets to hear the voices too. The reader is clued into what Georgia is experiencing. Now, I had to kind of fight for her because that's an unusual type of character to be your protagonist. I felt like it was important though. I worked 30 plus years in mental health, and I worked with some amazing people that have mental illness. At the same time, I've been a mystery writer, and the mystery genre has done a huge disservice to people with mental illnesses. The bad guy turns out to be some crazed schizophrenic, which is unrealistic, unfair, discriminatory. So I thought I wanted a character that has mental illness who's the hero. And that's Georgia. Georgia has mental illness, but she manages her symptoms. She goes to treatment. She has an important job. It's a stressful job. She manages it well. Her mental illness is a part of who she is, but she doesn't let it define her, and she manages it. And there are thousands of people like that in the world. And so I wanted a protagonist like her. And once she became real to me, which is how it feels when I'm writing, it was very clear who she was. And she's got a lot of drive. She's got a sense of humor. She's got determination. She's sassy. She's often in trouble because she's so sassy. But I think she's a pretty resonant character. I hope she is anyway, because I want to revisit. I'm revisiting her now. I feel like she's got another story to tell.
You bring her in as the protagonist the same way that the Clancy character really goes to bat for her as a social worker. Exactly.
And people what's interesting is I've worked with people in the mental health field who have mental illness. They're peer support counselors, and they can be incredibly effective care providers because they understand what it's like to have symptoms more so than I could as a social worker. So they can be real heroes. And so that's why I had to write her the way I did.
Absolutely. Yeah. I actually have a friend who is bipolar and is a peer counselor. So just exactly what you were talking about.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. How about research? What types of research did you do for the story?
I did a ton of research, mainly because it was a part of my job at the time, just learning about this crime. I learned a lot about the statistics of it, how it operates. Talking with law enforcement. I know a private investigator who that's one of her main jobs is to help when girls get pulled into trafficking operations. She pulls them out. that's, she does the investigation involved in finding them and getting them pulled back to life. And so yeah, I've talked to people, I've done tons of reading, I've talked to survivors. I'm not an expert, but I do know a heck of a lot about this crime.
Yeah, and I'm sure you know much more than you could even put into a book, because there's always so much more than what gets written in a story.
Yeah, and one thing, my bad guy is Hefe. Hefe is, and he operates a multi-tiered human trafficking operation. That is a device I use. That is not the typical human trafficker. But because I have him involved with labor trafficking, agrarian trafficking in farms, he has a factory that he operates that's with human trafficking victims. He's got massage parlors, and then different levels of brothels. That's a manipulation on my part, because I wanted to highlight all the different forms of human trafficking that are there, that are here. So that would be a very uncommon type of trafficker. Usually they don't diversify like he did, but that's kind of why I did that, because I really wanted people to get an idea of just how pervasive it is.
Yeah, he's definitely a scumbag. You really crammed all of that into one character.
He's a multi-dimensional scumbag.
Yes, he is. Yes, he is. You talked a little bit about Georgia kind of telling you that she needed to be written in the first person. How does character development work for you? Do you have a pretty good picture of each character when you start, or do you prefer that they evolve as you write? Is it a combination thereof?
I wish I could say I have total control over this process, but I don't. The author Rex Stout, who wrote the Nero Wolfe books, he said something really fascinating about character development that rang true for me. He said characters are either conceived or contrived. Contrived characters you have to piece together. You have to, they look like, have this kind of hair, they have this kind of physique, maybe they have this characteristic and that characteristic, and you're assembling them like a puzzle. Those are contrived characters. And then conceived characters just arrive. It's like they knock on your door and you open the door and there they are. And those characters, when they happen, they're very easy to write in some ways and harder to write in other ways. So I will say that my characters tend to be more conceived. It's like I start getting I have a seed of an idea, and then suddenly it blooms and it becomes a plant, and then it flowers, and then there they are in my room talking to me. What's challenging is sometimes they don't do what you want them to do. Once they become very real, they're going to drive a lot of what happens in the story. If that sounds a little mentally ill, that might be why I could write Georgia like I did, because I know what it's like to have voices in my head in a way,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Not exactly the same, but yeah, I understand what you're coming from.
Exactly. You just feel, oh my gosh, I can't. I even wrote a short story about a writer who's writing a romantic suspense story, and the character is standing over her shoulder and says, "Oh no, I would never say that." And they get into a debate as to what's going to happen next. And of course, the character is going to win. You just don't win those arguments.
Right.
Jumping back in so we can take the second break of this episode. When we come back, not be giving away the end of this book, just so you know. But we are going to talk a little bit about the reveal at the ending, if you will. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Carla Damron. Again, we are speaking about her novel, The Orchid. In terms of characters and development, I obviously don't want to give away the ending of the book, but in terms of endings and plot twists and all of those good things, do you have those in mind when you write, or do they sometimes surprise you?
Usually when I write, I know the main thread from the very beginning. So for example, who Hefe is has been a big surprise for readers. But for me, he was always who he was. And that's been fascinating. People are, I can't believe that that's who Hefe turned out to be. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry. That's just how it always was. That's how this novel came into being. And so sometimes the twist will, just kind of emerge as I write, because I do tend to be more of a pantser than a plotter. But the main thread, who's the bad guy, why he did it, and how he's going to get caught, I tend to know that from the beginning.
Okay. And what about writing crime fiction and suspense? What about that genre do you think draws you to writing within it?
Well, one reason is I love reading it. I have read mysteries since I was 6 or 7, So, and my whole family, it's a genetic thing. My whole family, we love to read mysteries. So that's one reason. But I've also written women's fiction, and I've done short stories. So I like to diversify. Currently, crime fiction, especially now, it's because crime fiction is less formulaic than it used to be like 15 years ago. It's really fun to write. I find it to be just really appealing. I like the relationship that you have with the reader and suspense that you're putting them on a roller coaster. I like that. I like that sensation as a reader, and I want to give my readers that same sensation. The other thing I like is that it's got a broad audience. The women's fiction does too, I will say that. But yeah, that's sort of, I don't really have a big interest in writing nonfiction because I like to make stuff up. And you're not supposed to do that when you write nonfiction.
Well, yeah, people get grumpy.
Yeah, people get grumpy when you do that in nonfiction.
Exactly. You mentioned that you feel like Georgia has another story. Is that what you're working on now or something else?
Yeah, so I've got kind of two things going on. I mentioned that I had the 3 Caleb Knowles novels, Keeping Silent, Spider Blue, and then Death in Zooville. And I hadn't really written one of those in 15 years. And I had a dream that was a Caleb scene about a year and a half ago. And so I kind of said, oh, it looks like I have to write another Caleb book. So I finished the 4th Caleb Knowles book, which is called Justice Be Done. And that has been sent off to the publisher. I'm waiting for his edits now. And then I'll probably do another revision when I get those edits. And then I'm drafting the sequel to The Orchid Tattoo. I was fascinated. I love these characters, for one. They wanted to stick around in my brain. But one of the things that fascinated me was, what happens in the aftermath. I don't want to keep writing about human trafficking, so this is a different kind of crime involved. But what happens next in these characters' lives? The ones that remain. What happens next in their lives? And so that really kind of took me on a journey, and I've started drafting. I'm about a third the way through, I would say.
Yeah, because you wrapped up the story nicely, but there's definitely more we can find out about these characters. So
yeah, there's still some threads out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
you said you started reading mysteries when you were about 6. You've always loved reading. How about writing? Did you always know you wanted to write or for publication, or is it something that you decided on later in life? How did that work for you?
Well, I really wrote my first book when I was about 7. It was called Mary Had a Horse. It was self-published in that it was, stapled, the pages were stapled together.
It was self-published. I love that.
It's really brilliant, Sarah. I mean,
I would like to read
it. So, and I wrote poetry and stuff as a kid and as a teenager. Then I kind of got away from writing. And then, when I got into social work, that's a pretty all-consuming field. And so, then I would say late 30s, early 40s, I thought, I really do want to try my hand at writing. And I had this idea of a novel, of a mystery novel, and I just started drafting it. And I didn't tell anyone. I was a closeted writer for months as I was drafting this. And then I got brave and I took a class at kind of an adult development class in writing fiction. And that was kind of a turning point because the instructor of that class invited me into her writing group. And that writing group really helped me to stay with it, to take writing seriously, to finish that first novel, and to develop a ritual, a routine about writing that's been a part of my life since then.
This is slightly off topic, but there's a cat in the orchid tattoo. Do you have animals in your books that are based on your rescues?
So I have a cat. The cat in the book is Fenway. I have a cat named Fenway. But the cat in the book is really more like an older cat I had who passed away, Eli. He was a big black cat who had a lot of attitude. But I love but Fenway is still with me now. She's 16. And yeah, I think pets are important. And I thought Georgia would have a cat. And this is Fenway's an interesting cat. He's got a lot of opinions about people. If he likes you, he likes you. And if he doesn't like you, she pays attention to that.
Yes. And I was just going to say, I think Georgia needs an interesting cat, not just a regular cat, a slightly quirky cat.
Yeah, he's pretty quirky, which is true of my animals as well. All of our animals are pretty quirky.
Sure. How about from your own path to publication, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Yeah, I mean, I had a very rocky path to publication, and it's still rocky. I would say the most important thing is perseverance. As a writer, you want to be read. Writing is communication. When I put words on paper, that's the first half of the communication. The second half is a reader reading those words and getting my point. So, to get my stuff read, I need to get it out there. And so that requires querying, querying agents, querying publishers. I skipped a step, though, before you even get to that point. Once you've written something, you need to revise it. And then after you've revised it, you need to revise it again. And then you need to send it to readers who will give you honest feedback. When I write, I have kind of a system down. So when I write a book, the first time I feel like it's ready to be read, I send it to my brother. And the reason I send it to my brother is he will read it quickly and he will tell me it's the best thing I've ever read. When I've written a book, I want to be told it's the best thing he's ever read.
Sure.
And then I send it to somebody who will tell me the truth. And I have friends that I got my MFA in creative writing, and I met some incredible writers in that program. And they're still my best readers. They read my stuff and they give me very honest critiques. This is working. This is not working. This is, your plot line sag right here. That stuff, while it can be a little painful to hear, is very important. So then I'll do another revision and then I'll send it to someone else. I mean, I do this several times before then I start querying. And so you can query agents if you want to try to win the lottery and get a big publisher, or you can, query small independent presses directly. I met my first agent at a literary conference, and he took me on. And so going to conferences can be really important. The hard thing is querying and getting rejected. Writers tend to be pretty sensitive, and you don't want to go through that process. You want the first person you query to accept your work. That's not realistic. You have to wear different hats. You have the creative writer hat, then you have the editor hat, where you're going to be a little merciless with your stuff and kill your darlings, as they say, to get the manuscript as sharp as it can be. And then you have to put on your sales hat, where you query and you write a really gripping query letter and a phenomenal synopsis that you're marketing this product that you have. And then you start knocking on doors, and the doors don't open for you, and that's painful. Or they open and slam shut. That's even more painful. But you've got to just go through those steps, and you have to develop a little bit of a thick skin. I did. And persevere, and have the attitude that every closed door is going to take you closer to the one that opens. And that's a difficult thing. And I always say that when you're in the querying process, go ahead and start another project, because querying can take a long time. And even if you get accepted for publication, you're usually 2 years out before the book's going to come out. So yeah. It's a difficult part of the process. And then some people just choose to self-publish, and that's an option as well. My caveat to that is, do not self-publish without getting it professionally edited.
I would agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. So it's a complex thing, this writing business. And I wish it was easier. I wish the getting your book out there part was easier, but it's not. And you just, if it matters to you, if it's important, then you just dive in and go.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Now it is time for our final break of this episode. When we come back, Carla will be talking about what she likes to read in her spare time. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Carla Damron.
How about when you are reading just for you? Who are your go-to authors?
I like to read for craft, and I like to read for pleasure. For craft, I love to read like Elizabeth Strout or not Sue Grafton. Let's see, Barbara Kingsolver. I'm reading one of hers right now. Then for pleasure, I love to read mysteries. During the pandemic, Louise Penny got me through the pandemic. The Inspector Gamache series. I think I have one more to read in that series. That's a phenomenal mystery series in that it's 20 something books, and over 20, she's got character arcs that have gone through 20 books. So imagine that you've got a character that 20 books ago has been through so many changes, but is still true to their self and still fascinating and interesting to the reader. That's a real master at work. So I've really enjoyed reading her stuff.
I finally started reading her recently. I've only read the first two, so I've got lots more to enjoy.
Yeah, it's like comfort reading, I think. And I'm a little in love with Inspector Gamache. Don't tell my husband.
I won't tell him.
I also like John Hart. I think he's a phenomenal mystery writer. The old Sue Grafton's. I love her stuff. So yeah, I read a lot of stuff.
Thank you. How about internet presence? Website, if you have one, and any place people can find you on social media.
I am carladamron.com, and I'm on Facebook, Carla Damron Writes. I'm on Instagram, Carla Damron. Twitter, Carla Writes Fic on Twitter. I feel like social media is pretty important. My biggest presence is probably on Facebook, just because I'm older, and that's kind of a more comfortable thing for me. But yeah, I like to be. It's also another way to reach readers. Readers will message me when they read my stuff and have questions, or I can't believe who Hefe was. I get that a lot.
Yeah, authors are mean sometimes with the characters that we you either love or hate. You're still mean with them.
That's the way life can be.
Exactly. Carla, we've talked about a few different things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure you highlighted during our time?
Yeah. So because of this subject matter, and because I'm a social worker, I'm donating a significant portion of my royalties to a project called Doors to Freedom. Doors to Freedom is a shelter for survivors of trafficking, and they provide housing, treatment, counseling, rehabilitation, vocational training to help these women rebuild their lives. When you escape a trafficking situation, quite often we see these women get pulled right back in. And it has to do with kind of Stockholm syndrome. They still connect with their trafficker. They still feel like that trafficker's their boyfriend. They've been brainwashed, and they've been so abused. They just don't know another life. And so these women need a great deal of rehabilitation, and it's an expensive process. Doors to Freedom, and their website is doorstofreedom.org, is an organization here in South Carolina that provides these services for survivors. But there are lots of other organizations like that need to be supported. So I always tell my readers to look for one near them and offer whatever support they can. We need to have thousands of these organizations because we don't want these women to be re-victimized. We don't want them pulled back into that life. And so this is just a little something that we can do to help them. Doors to Freedom, the women that are in the shelter make jewelry and sell it. They're called her bracelets, and they're bracelets that have kind of inspirational words on them. I've been taking those bracelets to events and selling them for the women, and they get 100% of the proceeds from that. So that's been another part of my mission, is to just, educate people about human trafficking, but also do my tiny little part to help some survivors.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And thank you also for taking the time to talk to me about the orchid tattoo and everything else we've talked about. I really appreciate it.
Well, this has been great, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners about the orchid tattoo and about my writing experience. If you're writing, keep at it, persevere. That's the bottom line. It takes a great deal of perseverance, but in the long run, it is worth it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you once again to Carla for joining me to talk about the orchid tattoo and writing and everything else. The important website, Doors to Freedom, that she mentioned there at the end, something that you might want to check out. And if you are a fan of crime fiction, if you're a fan of suspense, then you will definitely want to check out the orchid tattoo and maybe some of Carla's other crime fiction books, as well as her women's fiction book. Something to add to your to-be-read list if these are topics that are of interest to you. And I really appreciate Carla joining me to talk writing. Thank you for joining me for this interview with Carla. I hope that you will join me for the next episode. It's another 2-episode week next week. And so I'll be talking first with author
Kirsty Lohr about her nonfiction book, A Short History of Queer Women. I'm looking forward to speaking with her. What I have read is hilarious and very informative, so I'm really looking forward to talking to her about that book, and I hope that you will join me for that interview. Before I wrap things up, as usual, if you have not done so already and could do me the favor of liking, subscribing, following, what have you, on the platform on which you listen to this podcast. Very helpful, as is leaving a review, written or starred, helps to get the podcast out to more listeners such as yourselves. And you can also follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Come find the podcast and interact. I love to hear what you're reading. As always, I hope you're having a great week, or you had a great week, or your weekend coming up is looking fabulous. Whatever you have planned, I hope it involves you having some time to yourself, of course. If you have to work, still having some time for self-care and everything that goes into that. We have a birthday, actually we have 2 birthday parties, but for our same friend coming up this weekend. So looking forward to spending time with them and celebrating our friend on his birthday the day before and his actual birthday. Will be a lot of fun. Whatever you're doing, though, as always, I hope that it involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a really good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.